The Dark Secret of WEATHEREND by John Bellairs, Chapter 14. Anthony's heart sank. He looked around the dark, gloomy chamber, and he wanted to scream. They had come up here looking for some unknown weapon that they could use against Anders Borkman, but there was nothing here. Nothing but 4 walls, a ceiling, and a floor. "This place is empty," Anthony yelled, and his voice echoed weirdly from the vaulted ceiling. "It was just a lousy, rotten trick." Miss Eels laid her hand gently on Anthony's arm. "Calm down. Borkman is buried here, somewhere. At least, that's what the old guidebook says, and they hardly ever lie. And I'll bet when we find Borkman, we'll find whatever it is we're looking for. In the coffin, or not far away from it. Remember, the guidebook did mention some kind of fancy tomb sealing device. So before we give up, let's examine this place carefully and see what we can find out, okay?" Anthony nodded wearily. "Okay, Miss Eels," he said. "You take the flashlight, and I'll use my penlight, and we'll explore the whole place." Anthony's voice sounded dull and dispirited. He really didn't think they were going to find anything but dust and emptiness. Miss Eels went over to one of the walls of the tomb chamber and began moving her flashlight beam around. Anthony got down onto his hands and knees and began examining the terrazzo floor, which was made of concrete with lots of tiny marble chips set in it. The multicolored patterns on the floor were mostly whorls and spirals, but interspersed were other designs: a Star of David, a compass rosette, a pointing hand. Anthony wondered if these symbols meant anything. "Hey, Miss Eels," he called out suddenly. "Come on over here, quick. I think I found something." Miss Eels started to laugh. "I was just about to ask you to come over here." Anthony got up and walked over to where she was standing. She moved the flashlight beam all around, and he saw that the wall was covered with small, square, shiny porcelain tiles. Most of these were plain white, like the tiles on a bathroom wall, but some had colored decorations on them: a rose, a gold-colored castle, a white tower against a black background, a silver star with long rays, and a gateway that seemed to be up in the clouds. Anthony also recognized the Ark of the Covenant from pictures in the family Bible. It was certainly an odd assortment. "Interesting, eh?" said Miss Eels, tapping the wall with her hand. "Now tell me, do these pictures suggest anything to you?" "Nope," he said, frowning in a puzzled way. "Not a thing." "Well, they do to me. Remember that weird clue that ran, 'There are openings in the choir of the Blessed Virgin'? My friend, this is the answer. You see, all those tiles up there, the ones with the pictures, fit into a prayer that Catholics used to say. It's called the Litany of the Blessed Virgin. A litany is kind of a chant where the priest says one thing, and the congregation and the church chimes in with a response. Well, in the Litany of the Blessed Virgin, the priest uses symbolic descriptions that are supposed to represent what the Blessed Virgin is like, and then the congregation responds with, 'Pray for us,' 'Mystical Rose,' 'Pray for us,' 'Tower of Ivory,' 'Pray for us,' and so on. Do you see?" Anthony nodded. "Yeah, I guess so, but where does that get us?" Miss Eels smiled and shrugged. "It may get us absolutely nowhere, or it may get us into the real tomb of J.K. Borkman. But before I go on, may I ask what you have found?" Anthony pointed back toward the floor behind them. I found a crack in the floor. I mean, it's just a little thin line, but if you follow it all the way around, it's a rectangle, like a door." "Aha!" said Miss Eels triumphantly. "Here, hand me that tool bag. We're going to experiment." Anthony was still completely bewildered, but he picked up the tool bag and handed it to her. She stuck her hand in, and after fumbling a bit, pulled out a screwdriver. Anthony pointed the flashlight at the tile with the rose on it, and Miss Eels began to pry at the edges of the tile. Almost immediately it started to move, and suddenly it flipped out. Not all the way out, because a long curved piece of steel was bolted to the back of it. Soon, a sound like rolling marbles echoed from under the floor. Miss Eels grinned delightedly and rubbed her hands together. Just as I thought, she chortled. There's some kind of elaborate pinball-type combination lock under this floor. And I have a feeling that if we pull these squares out in the wrong order, we'll screw the entire works up and never get the door open. Now, what comes after Mystical Rose in the... Miss Eels' speech was interrupted by a loud metallic boom. Instantly, she and Anthony whirled around and looked toward the entrance of the tomb. The two bronze doors had been hurled inward by a mighty gust of wind, and they had slammed against the walls. Frightened, Anthony and Miss Eels rushed to the doorway and looked out. Several bolts of lightning crackled through the clouds above, and for a moment they could see the black silhouettes of distant buildings lit by a sudden bluish flash. Lightning crashed into a tree nearby, and it burst into fire. A sulphurous, scorched smell filled the air, and as Miss Eels and Anthony watched in horror, a blue ball of flame shot down out of the clouds, hitting the stone cornice over their heads and exploding into a million fiery points. They leaped back and each grabbed a bronze door, shoving them together until they clanged shut. Miss Eels gasped as she stumbled away from the door. She shone the flashlight at Anthony. He was pale and sweating, and his eyes were as big as saucers. "What?" was all Anthony could say. He was half out of his mind with fear. "It's the final storm," said Miss Eels grimly. "But we can still stop him. Come on, there's no time to lose." And seizing Anthony by the arm, she guided him back toward the tiled wall. Anthony pointed the flashlight at the pictured tiles. After Mystical Rose comes Tower of Ivory. At least, I hope so, said Miss Eels. And boldly she picked up the screwdriver and began prying at the tile with the white tower on it. Again the clattering of steel balls sounded from below. "House of Gold," she panted, working feverishly. "Ark of the Covenant, Gate of Heaven, Morning Star." And as all the tiles were flipped out, more noises rang out from below. Miss Eels and Anthony held their breath. Then there was a creaking noise, and a section of the floor dropped slowly downward, as if it were swinging on unseen hinges. Below lay utter darkness. "Well, what are you waiting for?" asked Miss Eels in a pretend brave voice. "Let's see what the prize in the Cracker Jack box is." They walked forward to the edge of the gaping hole. The flashlight beam swept down and showed a black wooden coffin that stood on two sawhorses. 6 tall candlesticks stood guard, 3 on either side. Candles had once burned in their sockets, but now they were only messes of drippy brown wax. Miss Eels made the sign of the cross and muttered a prayer, but Anthony just stood and gaped, awestruck. A howling gust of wind hit the bronze doors and rattled them. With a trembling hand, Miss Eels grabbed Anthony's arm. "Come on," she croaked hoarsely. "We may not have a lot of time. If I'm right, the object of our search is inside the coffin, with our dear departed friend. I know it's disgusting and scary, but we have to go down." Anthony stared at the rough wooden ladder that led down to the tomb chamber. Picking up the tool bag, he pitched it into the room below, and while Miss Eels held the flashlight for him, he started down. Then Miss Eels flipped the flashlight to him, and he held it as she climbed. In utter silence they approached the coffin. A dusty brass plate with Borkman's name and the dates of his birth and death shone dully on its lid. They began to fumble at the edges of the lid, which projected out over the sides of the coffin like the lid on a grand piano. To Anthony's great surprise, it was not nailed shut. Still, as he seized the polished wooden slab with trembling fingers, he was afraid to lift it. Miss Eels was beside him, her voice quiet and reassuring. "I know we're both scared," she said, "but we can't come this far and then choke up. I'll count to 3, and then we heave, okay?" Anthony nodded stiffly. The lid rose with a loud, grating crack, and Anthony involuntarily took a step backward. Unflinchingly, Miss Eels pulled the flashlight from the pocket of her parka and pointed the beam in. There was J.K. Borkman, what was left of him, a skeleton in a rotting Sunday suit. Over the empty eye holes perched rimless spectacles, and a knot of gray hair still clung to the dusty skull. His bony hands were folded over his chest, and the withered remains of a carnation were still scattered over one of the suit's sateen lapels. Anthony eyed the skeleton warily. He half expected it to come to life and leap at him, but it merely lay there, staring upward in a grim repose. Suddenly, Anthony noticed something attached to Borkman's waistcoat. Strung between the slit-like pockets of the garment was a tarnished gold chain with a large, old-fashioned gold watch dangling from the end. But it was the crystal of the watch that fascinated Anthony. It had a crack in it that ran from the center of the dial up through the part of the glass that covered the number 12. They had found the crack of noon. "Miss Eels, look!" Anthony yelled, frantically stabbing his finger at the watch with the cracked crystal. "It's the crack of noon. It has to be." Miss Eels rushed forward. She handed the flashlight to Anthony, gripped the edge of the coffin, and peered in. "You're right. There's no doubt about it, Anthony. You're a genius." Miss Eels reached out and picked up the watch. She held it gingerly and turned it around. Anthony was fascinated by the macabre scene, and he began to notice small details of the corpse that lay before him. The embroidered roses on the rotting, faded vest, the gilded elk's tooth that hung from one end of the watch chain, the bone that was missing from the ring finger of Borkman's left hand. "That's weird," thought Anthony. "I wonder what happened to it." He had an overpowering desire to reach out and rub his fingertips over the bony hand. He had never been near a real human skeleton before, and he wondered what the bones would feel like. Anthony's thoughts were interrupted by Miss Eels's voice. "Anthony," she said, "I want you to take the flashlight and go back to the tool bag. Inside it, you'll find my purse, and somewhere there ought to be a nail file. Let's see if we can get the crystal off the top of this watch. And hurry, please." Without a word, Anthony turned and started walking back into the darkness. He found the slouching leather satchel, and plunging his hand inside, he came up with Miss Eels's battered leather purse. In the midst of loose change, keys, coils of picture wire, plastic number puzzles, and inhalers, he dug out the nail file. Then he turned around and hurried back to her. "Hold the light steady," she said when Anthony had handed her the file. He did as he was told. The crystal was embedded in a gold rim that was fitted to the watch case. A hairline crack showed where the two parts were joined. Holding the watch tightly in her left hand, she poked at the crack with the point of the file. "The clue says Pam under the crack of noon," muttered Miss Eels as she struggled with the file. "I haven't the slightest idea what Pam is, but it ought to be under here." Anthony said nothing. He was becoming more and more jittery at the noises from outside. The muffled rumblings and the roar of wind grew louder. Meanwhile, Miss Eels was getting nowhere in her attempt to pry the watch open. Again and again she stabbed at the crack and tried to force the point of the file into it, but it couldn't be done. Anthony could feel blind panic rising inside him, but in spite of his fear, he was seized again by the strange urge to reach out and put his hand on Borkman's finger bones. He wanted to touch the place where the missing finger bone had fitted to the rest of the hand. While he still held the flashlight steady in his left hand, his right hand began to creep out toward the skeleton fingers. Suddenly, Miss Eels made a discovery. Dropping the file, she twisted the gold rim with her fingers. The rim began to move. "It unscrews!" Miss Eels exclaimed. "What a nitwit I was!" With a few quick twists of the wrist, Miss Eels had removed the crystal. Using the nail file, she began to pry the enameled face loose. While she worked on feverishly, Anthony's hand crept forward. After a few good twists, Miss Eels had worked the watch's face free. She wrenched off the hands, ripped off the face, and peered underneath. Inside the body of the watch, instead of wheels and springs, she found a crumpled playing card, the Jack of clubs. "Anthony, look at this!" Miss Eels cried. But at that point, Anthony's creeping hand had reached the finger with the missing joint. And when his finger touched the place where Borkman's lost finger bone had been, everything changed. The stone building rocked as if it had been hit by the force of a powerful explosion. Anthony found that he was paralyzed, frozen in place, with his hand touching the skeleton fingers. Miss Eels couldn't move either, but stood stiffly with the watch case in her hand. Her head was turned slightly, and she was staring at a figure that had suddenly appeared at the head of the coffin. It was a man wrapped in a cloak, so dazzlingly dark that it seemed to burn a hole in the gloomy blackness of the chamber. The face of the figure was lit by a wavering green light. It was a cruel, cold face with a heartless, mocking smile on its lips. It was the face of the creature called Anders Borkman.